For the third election in a row, the Republican Party has chosen Donald Trump as their presidential nominee. And today he chose Ohio Senator J.D. Vance as his running mate. Mr. Vance has only been in the U.S. Senate for 18 months. He's never otherwise held public office at all. He wrote a book about white working class despair. He worked as a venture capitalist. He went to Yale Law School, which is where he met his wife, who works at a high-end law firm in San Francisco and Washington, D.C., or at least she did until today, when she quit that firm after her husband was nominated to be Trump's running mate. Mr. Vance worked as a CNN contributor. He was a public affairs officer in Iraq with the United States Marine Corps. But as a running mate for Donald Trump, it is unavoidable to note that his record of remarks about Trump is one that I think could reasonably be described as rich. Maybe that's the word, rich.
I'm a never Trump guy. I never liked him.
It makes you think that at a fundamental level, this is sort of a he said, she said, right? And at the end of the day, do you believe Donald Trump, who always tells the truth? Just kidding. Or do you believe that woman on that tape?
I cannot stand Trump because I think he's a fraud. Well, I think he's a total fraud that is exploiting these people, who is a total fraud.
Like you said, I agree with you on Trump because I don't think that he's the person. I don't think he actually cares about folks.
So as a conservative who thinks that Trump does not have the answers and isn't qualified to be president, what are you going to do this election, if you don't mind saying?
My current plan is to vote either third party or, as I joke to my wife, I might write in my dog, because that's about as good as it seems. But, you know, I think there's a chance, if I feel like Trump has a really good chance of winning, that I might have to hold my nose and vote for Hillary Clinton. Ultimately, I think I'll probably vote third party. I might vote for this new guy who I really like, Evan McMullin, who I actually met the other day. But I think that I'm going to vote third party because I can't stomach Trump. I think that he's noxious and is leading the white working class to a very dark place.
Donald Trump's new running mate. I will vote for my dog over him. I will vote for a guy I just met, Evan McMullin, or Hillary Clinton, or some other third-party entity I can't even name. I will not vote for him because he is noxious and he is leading us in this country to a very dark place. He calls him a total fraud. In addition to that clip you saw there of him on MSNBC on Hardball with Chris Matthews saying that he believed a woman when she testified in the E. Jean Carroll case that she was sexually assaulted by Trump. He believed her, not Trump. He also liked a tweet around the same time saying that Trump had committed serial sexual assaults. Another one just calling Trump a monster. He has called Trump a moral disaster. He's called him cultural heroin. He has called him reprehensible. He has also called him, quote, an idiot. J.D. Vance is a very good writer. He wrote in a very good New York Times op-ed that, quote, Trump is unfit for our nation's highest office. He wrote to one former roommate about Trump, quote, I go back and forth between thinking Trump is a cynical a-hole like Nixon or that he's America's Hitler. How's that for discouraging? End quote. After this weekend's horrific shooting at a Trump rally in Pennsylvania, that assassination attempt against Trump that bloodied the former president, that killed a man, that wounded two others, J.D. Vance, now a U.S. Senator, posted online that it was Democrats' criticism of Trump as anti-democratic that, in his words, quote, led directly to the assassination attempt against Trump. Led directly. Many political observers went on the record this weekend saying that if J.D. Vance was indeed still on the short list to be considered to be Trump's running mate, that online post, that tweet from him this weekend saying that Democrats led directly to the assassination attempt against Trump, that surely would have disqualified him from staying on the short list. But he says that Democrats' criticism of Trump led directly to that assassination attempt, despite the fact that he himself called Trump America's Hitler. J.D. Vance says he has changed, that he no longer thinks all those terrible things that he has said about Trump in the past. And, you know, maybe that's true. Who among us knows what is in a man's heart? But in J.D. Vance's public positions now, there's nothing, literally nothing about Trump that Vance is not endorsing and indeed advancing. You may remember J.D. Vance coming to Trump's criminal trial in New York. He called it a sham trial. And while he was there, he attacked not only the judge in the case, but the judge's family. And he made sure to dress exactly like Trump while he did it. He has decided that he, too, is against windmills. Terrible, ugly windmills, he calls them. One of the weirdest Trump pet peeves of all. J.D. Vance has adopted that now for himself as well, just as he's adopted the red tie, white shirt thing. He calls people convicted for crimes related to the January 6th attack, quote, political prisoners. He says the 2020 election was not a real election. He says he will not commit to accepting the results of the next election in 2024. It is, of course, unusual for a president to run for a second term with a different running mate than they had in their first term. But clearly, Mike Pence was no longer available. Mike Pence not an option for Donald Trump this time around after the violent mob Trump unleashed on the Capitol looked for Mike Pence to try to hang him while Trump egged them on. Vice President Pence has since made history as saying that he explicitly cannot endorse his former running mate for a second term in office. How do you talk yourself into wanting Trump to pick you for this job when the last guy Trump picked for this job, he also nearly got killed when he told an armed violent mob that Pence was the man to blame for all they were so upset about? J.D. Vance told CNN this year that he doesn't think that Mike Pence was ever really in any real danger on January 6th. He also says that had he been Mike Pence, had he been vice president himself on January 6, 2021, he would have thrown out the real electoral votes and done what Trump wanted. The lead story in the New York Times on Saturday night before the terrible shooting happened in Pennsylvania was this story about how Republicans have already laid the groundwork to have their officials all over the country refuse to certify the election results this year. Groups like the Heritage Foundation are saying publicly that some sort of amorphous conditions exist in the country now, right now, that already justify any election official at any level refusing to certify the results. They are already intending that the election results will not be certified. And that is intended, and it may very well prevent any normal count of the vote this year, any normal tally of the votes, including in the Electoral College. The idea is that there will just be chaos in Washington. There will be a fight, some kind of actual fight for power in Washington, instead of it being decided by our votes in the states. Well, now, as of tonight, they've got as a running mate for Trump someone who is committed and who is insisting that there was nothing wrong with what happened on January 6th. It's just that it didn't work. And if he'd been there, it would have worked. So put him in there. As we've been discussing tonight, J.D. Vance wants a national abortion ban. He thinks even rape and incest survivors should be forced to give birth against their will. He thinks women who are being violently abused by their husbands should be made to stay in their marriage. J.D. Vance has a lot to offer in terms of his policy positions that are very unpopular with most of the American public. That said, he does also say that Trump should have been able to seize power despite the vote in 2020. And if you're going to hold power despite the vote, despite the expressed will of the people, then your unpopular positions will never be a problem for you ever again, because nobody gets to vote on who's in office. President Biden sitting down today with NBC News anchor Lester Holt in a combative and feisty interview. Lester, look, why don't you guys ever talk about the 28 lies he told? Where were you on this? Why doesn't the press ever talk about that? 28 times it's confirmed he lied in that debate. What's with you guys? Come on, I'm on the horse. Where have you been? Even at the end there, come back and we'll talk about the stuff that matters. We'll talk about the issues, meaning stop asking me about me and about these politics. Our colleague Lawrence O'Donnell joins us. Hi, Lawrence.
Hi. That was Lester Holt doing Lester Holt and Joe Biden doing Joe Biden. And look, it should be obvious enough there. Maybe it isn't that Joe Biden really likes Lester Holt and thinks he's admires his work. I didn't think that was a combative interview. I thought that was Biden having to respond to questions that were challenges, and he responded to them, his way.
I mean, combative in the sense that he was punchy. He was there to be like, give as much as he was getting.
Response. He was like close to the net in tennis, sort of a thing. Yeah, and he knows he has to do that. But the one thing that he can't erase from any of these interviews is how old he is, and that's the fact. I've always known that's how old he is. I knew what his age was 5 years ago. I knew what it would be now. I knew what his voice was going to sound like. It's going to sound weaker. It's the way it happens. His voice is going to be softer, weaker. But the question that Lester was really there when this was originally scheduled, what he was really there to ask about and find out about is, has the storm passed? That was the real question. There's only one person who knows the answer to that, because there's only one person who decides, and that's Joe Biden. And for Joe Biden, the storm passed as soon as it started, because he just said, no, I'm staying in this race. He's never wavered from that. And so, this is where we are with that tonight. I don't think anything changed on that. I don't think that anything about that interview is going to change anyone's ability to change Joe Biden's mind.
He asked him the question that I think I've heard a lot in just offline personal conversations about this with people just in my life, not in the news business, which was, who do you listen to on deeply personal issues like the decisions whether to stay in the race or not? I can't tell you the number of handicapping decisions I've had with people about whether he only listens to his wife, or he only listens to whatever that advisor is nobody can ever remember the name of, or he only listens to his son, or whatever. And his answer was as short as it could possibly be. Who do you listen to on deeply personal issues like the decisions whether to stay in the race or not? Pause. Me. Me. Look, I've been doing this a long time. The idea that I'm the old guy, I'm old, but I'm only 3 years older than Trump, number one. And number two, my mental acuity has been pretty damn good. I've gotten more done than any president has in a long, long time in 3.5 years, so I'm willing to be judged on that. I understand when people say, God, he's 81 years old. Whoa, what's he going to be like when he's 83 years old or 84 years old? It's a legitimate question to ask.
I mean, I think what we're seeing here is that there is somewhat of a time lag between the news cycle and the subject of the news cycle. I think to Lawrence's point, for Joe Biden, the thing that's relevant today is the campaign as it is today. And there's still a news cycle that is still into, 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, and the question of whether he stays on the ballot. And so Joe Biden, I think, expressed some annoyance with the media for staying in that mode when he's ready to keep combating the battle at hand. And so I think there is just this lag, and I'm not sure if he can escape it, because people keep asking him the question he's answered already. And the reality is, as Lawrence said, within the Democratic Party rules, there really is no way to force him out if he decides he ain't going.
I just hope Lester got a date for that issues interview. When is that going to happen? Let's do that next Monday.
This is live video right now of President Biden arriving in Las Vegas. I mentioned that he's going to be doing that event with the NAACP tomorrow. That is in Las Vegas, Nevada. Again, President and his campaign made the decision in the immediate wake of the shooting on Saturday night in Pennsylvania to take down all of their political ads and also to cancel all political events. That does not mean that the president cancels all events. He does lots of things as president that are on his official presidential schedule that don't have to do with the campaign. This NAACP event tomorrow and an event with Unitas US on Wednesday are both considered to be on sort of that side of the ledger, so he's keeping up with those things. But it is actually interesting watching that interview, right? Seeing politics continuing on as usual. Nicole, I was thinking about you and your past role with presidential campaigns, thinking about, I was actually remembering me buttonholing you at the Republican convention in 2008, trying to get you to let John McCain do an interview with me. You laughed in my face. But how big a deal would it have been?
I want to give some context to the laugh. It was because in John McCain, John McCain was such a different figure than George W. Bush, George W. Bush, I don't think, had tracked Keith Olbermann's move from ESPN to cable news. And so he wouldn't have known the things being said about him. But John McCain watched. And so John McCain knew that on this network he was called the worst person. So I didn't laugh at you.
Yes, you
I
did.
laughed because I knew how much news John McCain consumed. and how hurt he was by some of the criticism. So I just can't let it stand that you would say that.
And so you were laughing because, there's no way ever
because Phil Griffin called me, was not my boss, right afterward, and I was like, no, yeah, I know, she got me. I don't think so, but I will pass the request. Anyway, we need another hour to talk about how that went over.
So now, at this point in the campaign, while the Republican convention is going on, imagine, right, while the opposing party's convention is going on, you pull all your campaign ads down indefinitely.
Yeah, I wouldn't do that, but you know which party I came from. I mean, look, I think that all I'm going to say about the interviews is all that I said during the entire Alvin Bragg case in New York. We have no idea how the jury is processing any of these bits of information, and the jury isn't us, not even close. The jury is the voters. And so I mean, to your point, though, the reason it's still in the news is because Thursday night, in a riveting, sweat all over my body inducing appearance, Jim Himes came up and gave, he is a patriot. Whatever you think of Jim Himes, he believes in the country. He believes in our alliance with Ukraine. He has been there. He believes in our role in the world. And he says in no uncertain terms, loyalty destroyed the Republican Party. I will not let it destroy mine. And so I don't see a path for him to win, and we can't squander our democracy out of loyalty. So the reason it's still a news story is because compelling people like Jim Himes are doing compelling interviews with people like Alex Wagner. But in terms of what he and Lester talked about, the jury is the voters, and I have no idea how they'll experience that, and no idea anymore. On the campaign's apparatus, it should, raise its flag and keep campaigning because we have an election in 115 days.
I was, given the fact that they pulled their ads, I thought he was surprisingly political in the interview.
Yes.
When asked about political violence and political violent rhetoric, Biden pivoted back to Charlottesville, explaining why he got in the race, talked about Trump saying there are good people on both sides. He segued to January 6th, talking about what happened at the Capitol. I mean, at every opportunity, he goes back to Trump's record being someone who has stoked and perhaps, in the eyes of some, incited violence directly. So he's not shying away from a political fight, at least rhetorically, when you hear it coming from the man, despite whatever his campaign is doing in this particular hour.
Well, and I think it was important. I mean, he said, why wouldn't you talk about him being an existential threat? He's also, putting his foot down and saying, no, we're not going to stop talking about the threats to democracy, which I think will be heartening to people who are his voters, because I think what J.D. Vance and other folks on the Republican side have tried to do is to preemptively come out and sort of threaten Democrats with becoming the ones who are purveying political violence if they keep talking about Donald Trump as an existential threat to democracy, trying to sort of work the refs and say, well, you can't talk about that anymore because now that's inciting violence. I think what he said in this interview tonight and 3 follow-ups from Lester Holt, he really did say very firmly, we're going to keep talking about these threats because they actually are threats.
Lawrence, in terms of the president's overall performance and how he is handling what is still an ongoing storm within his own party and among his own supporters and among people even who love him, but who feel desperately that the Democrats need to give themselves the best chance of winning this election. How do you think that he is handling this part of political combat that he now has to wage?
Well, if you look at it in terms of his objective is to accept the nomination at the convention and give a rousing speech, he's handling it flawlessly from his end, absolutely flawlessly. You certainly can't say the same for the other side, whatever that other side is. There were those reports on Thursday, and I laugh at them because I used to live in the world where those reports came from, that there were going to be 40 Democrats, specific number, 40 Democrats come out on Friday after that NATO summit was complete, and those 40 Democrats would just order Joe Biden out of the race. They would do it publicly. Never happened.
Right.
Didn't happen Saturday. Never happened. They had 48 hours before 6 p.m. on Saturday. None of them. Okay? So all of that guesswork stuff. And by the way, if you work in that institution, there's always 40 Democrats, there's always 40 Republicans who are saying they're going to do X against their president all the time. And they don't, almost all the time. And so, if 20 had come out, I would say, he's got a continuing struggle going on. But I think you saw it actually end. If you're using all the available evidence, it really looked like it ended before noon on Friday.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.